Ladies and gentlemen, sit down, grab some snacks, and get ready to have your mind blown, because you're watching the ups and downs of Nicolas Cage.
Yes, thank you, hello, and welcome to the ups and downs of Nicolas Cage, where every week we take a look at the best and the worst that Nicolas Cage has to offer. As always, I'm your host, Logan Mock, and today we are looking at the most misused potential of a film I've ever seen. We're looking at 2014's Dying of the Light. Dying of the Light was released in 2014, written and directed by Paul Schrader, and the film follows Nicolas Cage as a CIA agent with an extreme case of dementia who must find a terrorist that he's been hunting down his entire life before he forgets everything completely. And if you think that premise sounds interesting and could be made into a fun movie, you would probably be right. Paul Schrader did not get that memo because he decided to make a really poorly edited, boring schlock of a movie. There's so much misused potential in this film that could have been explored deeper, but it's a very standard film. It had a budget of $5 million. I could not find anywhere how much it made in theaters or for streaming, but the $5 million does look okay. The movie does not look as bad as I thought it would be. They managed to get some decent shots out of it. Nicolas Cage looks older. He has some okay makeup. But the editing is where it really just suffers. In order for Nicolas Cage to learn any new information, he has to be driving. They have him driving multiple times in the film, especially when he doesn't need to. Like when he's been fired, he's driving to somewhere, and the somewhere isn't necessarily told, and he doesn't really have anywhere to go because he's just gotten fired from his job. And he's having flashbacks, and that's how we learn information. Because Nicolas Cage is learning information that he already knows. It's just flashbacks back to when he was fighting this terrorist, and it's just for us to do. And that's an okay way to do exposition. Nicolas Cage does have a partner who doesn't know anything about Nicolas Cage's terrorist friend. And Nicolas Cage could have explained stuff to him, and then we would have understood it. And that would have been a more natural way to progress the film along, to give the plot more depth. But instead it's Nicolas Cage has a shaky hand, he grabs his head, closes his eyes, and then we have a flashback of information that we could infer pretty easily, or stuff we already know just being reiterated. Another case of misused potential is Nicolas Cage's debilitating mental disease. He has an extreme case of dementia, which means in a few months he's going to forget pretty much everything he's ever known. And you know, a debilitating mental disease sounds like a pretty big deal. You'd expect a disease that makes you forget your life to be really played up and be a central theme of the film. You'd expect it to, take up a lot more than what it did. But it didn't. It was more of a minor inconvenience to him at certain times because he's doing everything perfectly fine and just has an occasional case of the shaky hands and wanders outside once or twice. And with the debilitating mental disease that's only played off as a bump in the road for him comes something that his doctor said was unreliable sensory perception. Now, sensory perception is the 5 senses: touch, taste, smell, sight, hearing. And if you have unreliable stuff, then that means that you could hear things that weren't really being heard. You could not see stuff that is there or see stuff that isn't there, or touch something and not be able to feel it. Or there's so many possible roads it could have gone down for like a final confrontation of Nicolas Cage and his terrorist friend, that like he's seeing multiple of him and he has to like attack the right one, but he doesn't know which one is right, or he's hearing stuff. It could have been a really interesting plot device, and it could have led to a pretty big twist where really none of it was happening and Nicolas Cage is in the final stages of losing his dementia, and he's replaying that so that he feels like he could win. But it doesn't happen. It's just a standard film, really misused potential. And that's all I can say about it without going to spoilers. So, after an ad break, I'll go into spoilers.
Interested in making your own podcast but not sure where to start? Anchor makes it easy. Anchor has creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and best of all, it's free. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
So the film starts off with Nicolas Cage at a CIA training camp, and he's giving a rousing speech to the new CIA recruits, talking about how, despite the fact that the CIA is considered a joke now, that they still heard the call and still want to help their country. And then he is heading to his CIA workplace. We learn that he was an agent for 30 years, and his main goal was hunting down a terrorist by the name of Banir. And after he got out of the Banir situation, because everyone assumes he's dead, he was put in desk duty. So he's doing analytical stuff, not really in the field as much as he would like to. And everyone believes that Banir is dead, but Nicolas Cage is firm in the belief that Banir is alive. And this is one of the biggest grievances I have with this film. We know Banir is alive because it constantly cuts to him because he has some debilitating genetic disease where he needs like blood transfusions. He's ill. He can barely walk. He's a very sickly man. And Nicolas Cage tells us this in a later scene. He says that his father had it and that it remained dormant in him, and now he probably has it. And then Anton Yelchin, who is his CIA friend, he said, there's this guy in Kenya who's been asking for the blood transfusion and medicine required to treat this genetic disease. And a much better way to handle this would have been having Nicolas Cage know he's alive, or at least believe that he's alive, but we don't know it. Because everyone is always asking him, are you sure he's alive? Are you sure you're not just making this up? And it doesn't really add any tension when in the next scene we see him alive and getting medicinal treatment. There's no stakes. There's no intrigue that could have been added. Like, Nicolas Cage is looking for him this whole time, and then he finally breaks through, and then he finds that Banir is a crippled person. He can barely walk on his own. He's breathing heavily. He's obviously an ill person, and then he has to decide whether or not he wants to kill him or let him die. But no, they continuously cut from Bannier to Nicolas Cage, and there's no real tension because if you know both sides, if you know what the bad guys are doing and what the good guys are doing, then there's no real tension. Well, that's not true. You can create tension if you know what both the bad guys and the good guys are doing. But if the bad guy is just sitting in his house all day long and he can barely move, and then on the good guy side, everyone's questioning whether or not the bad guy is even alive, then it really loses all the tension, all the shock value that you could have gotten from a big reveal at the end. But after Nicolas Cage learns from his CIA friend that Bannier might be alive based on the medicine and blood transfusions that have been ordered to a place in Kenya, he goes to the CIA director and says, "Hey, I think Bannier's alive with all this information." And the CIA director calls in a doctor man, and they say, "Look, we know you went to a doctor and that he diagnosed you with dementia, and so we think that you're making this up and that you will put other agents at risk." And he says, "I'm at risk. You guys ruined America." He goes on this tangent about a bunch of failed U.S. missions, like Benghazi, Vietnam War, I assume, was in there. There's a lot of Nicolas Cage outbursts about how much he is disappointed by people. But Nicolas Cage is then fired, and when he's driving on his way to home, he gets pulled over by the police because he has a disease that can make him crash on the road, and so he has to take his car. And you think that would come up later, and it almost does, but it doesn't. I'll talk about that when we get there. And Nicolas Cage and Anton Yelchin are doing some CIA work. They go to one of Nicolas Cage's friends in Romania because there's a doctor who's going to Kenya to treat Bannier, and Nicolas Cage wants to take over for him so he can go face-to-face with Bannier. And you feel like that the Central Intelligence Agency would realize that this is happening because, he's traveling to Romania and then traveling to Kenya to kill Bannier. And that's exactly what they don't want him doing. And he does use fake passports to look like the doctor in order to not be detected by anyone that he's a CIA agent. But earlier in the movie, the CIA director and CIA doctor man specifically said, "You think that you can use a fake ID to go to a doctor with a fake name and we wouldn't know about it?" Showing that they do have the resources capable to know when Nicolas Cage is using identification that is not his in order to travel anywhere. And that was traveling to a doctor's office to get a diagnosis for a medication. This is going to Romania and to Kenya in order to assassinate a terrorist that has been missing for 20 years. So you think they'd be a bit more keen of stopping Nicolas Cage. They'd be a bit more on it. But they're not. None of the CIA people ever seen again. Anyway, Nicolas Cage and Anton Yelchin head to Kenya. Nicolas Cage has a few scenes where he's spacing out, walking all over, because of his dementia. But this is what I mean. It's a minor inconvenience because after Anton Yelchin finds him and says, "Hey, are you okay?" He says, "Yeah, what are you talking about?" And then he is fine for the rest of the film. So Nicolas Cage goes to Bannier's place. He says to Anton Yelchin, "Hey, if I'm not out in an hour, do whatever you want." Saying, you can come and get me or you can leave.